Hello family, welcome to True Life Stories. Please subscribe and leave a like for us, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. Hannah had always believed in the beauty of love. She dreamed of a life filled with warmth, mutual respect, and unwavering partnership. When she met Nelson, it felt as though the universe had answered her prayers. Nelson was everything she had hoped for, kind, attentive, and ambitious. He treated her like she was the most precious thing in his life, and their courtship was a whirlwind of laughter, shared dreams, and tender moments. Their wedding was a celebration of love and unity, a moment where two souls promised to build a life together. Family and friends gathered to witness the union, their blessings filling the air with an infectious joy. Among the sea of smiling faces was Mrs. Charlotte, Nelson's stepmother, who had raised him after the tragic passing of his father. While Mrs. Charlotte's smile was polite and her words kind, there was a faint air of disapproval that Hannah couldn't quite shake. In the early days of their marriage, life seemed like a dream. Their home was filled with love and laughter, the kind of partnership Hannah had always envisioned. Nelson's love for her was evident in every gesture. He left sweet notes on the kitchen counter, remembered her favorite flowers, and was always eager to hear about her day. In return, Hannah poured her heart into creating a warm and nurturing home for them. Together, they felt unstoppable. Yet, behind the walls of their cozy home, a subtle tension lingered. Mrs. Charlotte, while never openly hostile, often seemed to find ways to insert herself into their lives. She would make unannounced visits, her presence a quiet reminder that her influence in Nelson's life was unwavering. Her words were rarely outright critical, but there was an edge to her tone when she spoke to or about Hannah. "She's a nice girl," Mrs. Charlotte would say to Nelson when Hannah was out of earshot, her voice tinged with faint condescension. "But do you think she understands what it means to be part of this family? To truly commit?" Nelson, ever the peacemaker, brushed off these remarks. He assured Hannah that his mother's protectiveness stemmed from love and that she simply needed time to adjust. Hannah, wanting to believe him, focused on showing Mrs. Charlotte respect and kindness, hoping that her actions would soften the older woman's heart. As days turned into months, small cracks began to form in the otherwise perfect facade of their life. Mrs. Charlotte's subtle jabs about Hannah's upbringing or her career choices planted seeds of doubt in Nelson's mind. Although he loved Hannah dearly, he found himself occasionally second-guessing her decisions, unsure if they aligned with the expectations his mother had instilled in him. Hannah, on the other hand, felt the weight of Mrs. Charlotte's quiet judgment. The disapproving glances, the insinuating comments, each one chipped away at her confidence. She confided in Nelson, expressing her concerns in measured tones, but he dismissed them, unwilling to confront the tension between the two women he loved most. Despite these undercurrents, Hannah held on to the happiness they had built. She believed that their love was strong enough to withstand any challenge, even the subtle disapproval of Mrs. Charlotte. But unbeknownst to her, this seemingly minor conflict was the beginning of a storm that would soon test the very foundation of their marriage. Their love story, once so full of hope and joy, now carried the weight of unspoken fears and unaddressed tensions. While Hannah and Nelson remained committed to each other, the shadow of Mrs. Charlotte's disapproval began to grow, foreshadowing the trials yet to come. Life in the early days of marriage, though filled with love, began to reveal its hidden challenges. Hannah, still buoyed by her affection for Nelson, strove to adjust to the dynamics of her new family. She wanted to believe that with time, she could win over Mrs. Charlotte, whose presence loomed over their household like a quiet storm. Mrs. Charlotte's hostility was never overt. She prided herself on maintaining an air of propriety. But her true feelings were unmistakable, reflected in the sharp undertones of her comments or the way her gaze lingered disapprovingly on Hannah. Whether it was a passing remark about Hannah's work keeping her too busy or an exaggerated sigh when she saw Hannah handling household tasks, her disdain was clear to anyone willing to look closely. For Hannah, every encounter with Mrs. Charlotte was a balancing act. She maintained a composed smile and respectful tone, despite the older woman's veiled criticisms. One evening, as they gathered for dinner, Mrs. Charlotte pointedly remarked, "It's admirable how dedicated you are to your career, Hannah. Though I do wonder if Nelson gets the attention he deserves." Her words hung in the air, laden with insinuation, as Hannah swallowed her retort and simply replied, "I try my best to balance everything." Nelson, seated between them, chuckled awkwardly, and changed the subject. It was a pattern Hannah was beginning to notice: his reluctance to address his mother's remarks head-on. When she later brought up the incident, Nelson brushed it aside. "She didn't mean anything by it," he assured her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You know how she is, she just worries about me. Don't let it bother you." But it did bother Hannah. She felt the sting of Mrs. Charlotte's words and the ache of Nelson's unwillingness to defend her. Even though she loved her husband deeply, she couldn't shake the feeling of being alone in this silent battle. Her patience, though steadfast, began to wear thin as the weeks turned into months, and Mrs. Charlotte's passive-aggressive behavior showed no signs of abating. The cracks in their relationship widened as Mrs. Charlotte's presence became more pervasive. She would show up unannounced, rearranging things in their home under the guise of helping out or offering unsolicited advice on how Hannah could be a better wife. One afternoon, Hannah came home to find Mrs. Charlotte in her kitchen, reorganizing the pantry. "I thought I'd help you out," she said with a tight smile. "I noticed things were a bit chaotic." Hannah bit her tongue, forcing a smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Charlotte. I'll take it from here." Later that evening, when she expressed her frustration to Nelson, his response left her feeling even more isolated. "She's just trying to help, Hannah. She means well." He didn't see the subtle condescension in Mrs. Charlotte's actions, or the toll it was taking on Hannah's spirit. For Nelson, the situation was far more complex than he let on. He adored Hannah, but his loyalty to his mother was deeply ingrained. Mrs. Charlotte had been his rock during his childhood, sacrificing everything to ensure his future after the untimely death of his father. Her opinions carried weight, and he struggled to reconcile his love for Hannah with the quiet disapproval of the woman who had shaped him. In his mind, these tensions were temporary, something time and patience would eventually resolve. But for Hannah, the cracks were growing deeper. Each passing day brought new instances of Mrs. Charlotte's disapproval and Nelson's unwillingness to confront it. The balance she had tried so hard to maintain was tipping, and her once unshakable optimism began to waver. Still, she held on to hope. She believed that her love for Nelson and her dedication to their marriage would eventually bridge the gap between her and Mrs. Charlotte. But the unspoken tensions between them were like a slow-moving current, eroding the foundation of their relationship bit by bit. And while neither Hannah nor Nelson fully realized it yet, the seeds of conflict were taking root, preparing to bloom into a storm that would test their bond in ways they never imagined. Mrs. Charlotte's veiled criticisms of Hannah had always carried a sting, but now her discontent took a more insidious turn. Subtle remarks gave way to pointed conversations with Nelson, carefully crafted to plant seeds of doubt in his mind. Her approach was calculated, cloaked in concern, and laced with just enough ambiguity to leave Nelson questioning his own perceptions. One evening, as Nelson sat with his mother during her usual unannounced visit, she brought up Hannah's long hours at work. "Nelson, don't you think Hannah is pushing herself too much? I mean, she's so dedicated, but I worry about the toll it's taking on your marriage. A wife should prioritize her home, don't you think?" Her voice was calm, almost tender, but her words struck a chord. Nelson, caught off guard, shrugged. "She works hard, Mom, but she's doing it for us. She wants us to have a good life." Mrs. Charlotte nodded, her expression a mask of understanding. "Of course, I admire her ambition. But sometimes ambition blinds us to what's truly important. I just don't want you to feel neglected." She let the words hang in the air, their weight settling in Nelson's mind long after the conversation ended. These subtle manipulations began to seep into Nelson's thoughts. Though he loved Hannah and admired her dedication, he couldn't help but notice how often she came home late or seemed preoccupied with work. Mrs. Charlotte's words had awakened a tiny, nagging voice of doubt, and it grew louder with each passing day. Hannah, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. She continued to pour herself into her marriage, balancing her career with her responsibilities at home as best as she could. She still believed that Mrs. Charlotte's attitude toward her was a temporary hurdle, something she could overcome with time and patience. Her optimism, however, blinded her to the signs of trouble. One evening, after another long day at work, Hannah returned home to find Nelson unusually distant. She greeted him with a warm smile and a kiss on the cheek, but he barely responded. "Is everything okay?" she asked, concerned. Nelson hesitated before replying. "Yeah, just tired." But the hesitation lingered in the air, a crack in the foundation of their trust. Mrs. Charlotte's influence deepened as she escalated her efforts. She began sharing fabricated or exaggerated anecdotes, designed to cast doubt on Hannah's loyalty. "I saw Hannah in town the other day," she told Nelson one afternoon, her tone casual. "She was with a colleague, nothing unusual, of course, but they seemed very close." She gave him a knowing look, then quickly added, "I'm sure it's nothing, but you know how people talk." Nelson brushed it off at first, unwilling to believe anything that cast his wife in a negative light. But the more Mrs. Charlotte repeated her concerns, the harder it became to ignore them. Her words, always delivered with an air of reluctant concern, began to erode his trust in Hannah. He started to question her absences, her late nights, and even her intentions. Hannah, sensing Nelson's growing distance but not understanding its cause, tried harder to bridge the gap. She planned date nights, cooked his favorite meals, and reassured him of her love whenever she noticed his mood shifting. But no matter how much effort she put in, the unspoken doubts planted by Mrs. Charlotte remained. One fateful day, Nelson stumbled upon a situation that seemed to confirm his worst fears. A misunderstanding that Mrs. Charlotte seized upon with expert precision. Hannah had stayed late at work for a project and had gone out for coffee with a male colleague to discuss a presentation. Someone, likely Mrs. Charlotte's doing, ensured that Nelson found out, framing the interaction in a way that seemed suspicious. When Nelson confronted Hannah, his voice tinged with frustration and suspicion, she was taken aback. "Why didn't you tell me you were staying late and going out with a colleague?" he demanded. Hannah, confused by his tone, replied, "I didn't think it was a big deal. It was just work." Nelson's doubt flared, fueled by Mrs. Charlotte's earlier insinuations. "It's not about work, Hannah. It's about trust. Why didn't you think I'd want to know?" Hannah, hurt and bewildered, tried to explain, but the damage was done. Mrs. Charlotte's manipulation had succeeded in driving a wedge between them. Nelson, torn between his love for Hannah and the doubts his mother had planted, began to pull away emotionally. Meanwhile, Mrs. Charlotte watched from the sidelines, satisfied that her efforts were bearing fruit. For her, this was not just about Hannah. It was about reclaiming her place in Nelson's life and ensuring that no one came between them. The seeds of betrayal had been sown, and they were beginning to grow, threatening to unravel the love and trust that once held Hannah and Nelson together. Mrs. Charlotte had always been a master manipulator, but now she decided to take her schemes to a new level. The subtle insinuations and calculated doubts she had sown in Nelson's mind were not enough for her. She wanted to ensure that Hannah would be gone for good, and to do that, she crafted a damning lie. One afternoon, Mrs. Charlotte paid Nelson a visit while Hannah was at work. Her demeanor was grim, her expression one of reluctant sorrow. "Nelson," she began, her voice trembling just enough to seem genuine, "I've been debating whether to tell you this. You know I only want what's best for you, but as your mother, I can't stay silent any longer." Nelson's stomach tightened. He could sense that whatever she was about to say would shake him to his core. "What is it, Mom?" he asked, his voice cautious. Mrs. Charlotte hesitated for effect before continuing. "A friend of mine saw Hannah last week, with another man. They were at a restaurant, sitting very close, and they seemed intimate." She looked down, feigning reluctance. "I didn't want to believe it, Nelson, but when I asked around, I heard whispers. People saying she's been spending a lot of time with this man." Nelson froze, his mind racing. He wanted to dismiss her claims outright, but the seeds of doubt she had planted over the months had taken root. His love for Hannah clashed with the nagging voice in his head, the one Mrs. Charlotte had carefully nurtured. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Charlotte reached for his hand, her expression one of pained sincerity. "I wish I wasn't, but I couldn't bear to see you hurt, Nelson. You deserve someone who's completely loyal to you, someone who puts you first." Nelson spent the rest of the day in turmoil. Memories of Hannah's late nights at work, the coffee outing with her colleague, and Mrs. Charlotte's countless warnings flooded his mind. Each moment, now tainted by suspicion, seemed to confirm his worst fears. He didn't want to believe that Hannah was unfaithful, but the evidence, however circumstantial, felt overwhelming. That evening, when Hannah returned home, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. Nelson's usual warmth was replaced by coldness, his gaze distant and hard. "Nelson, is everything okay?" she asked, setting down her bag. He turned to her, his face etched with pain and anger. "How long have you been seeing him?" he demanded. Hannah blinked, confused. "Seeing who?" "Nelson, what are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb with me, Hannah," he snapped, his voice rising. "My mother told me everything. She saw you with another man, out in public, acting like a couple. How could you do this to me? Hannah's heart sank as she realized the depth of the accusations. Nelson, I don't know what your mother thinks she saw, but I haven't done anything wrong. I've been working late, yes, and I've had coffee with colleagues, but it's all been professional. I would never betray you. But Nelson, overwhelmed by emotion and Mrs. Charlotte's manipulations, couldn't hear her. You expect me to believe that? After everything? My mother wouldn't lie to me, Hannah. She's only looking out for me. Tears welled up in Hannah's eyes as she pleaded with him. Nelson, please listen to me. I love you. I've always been faithful to you. Whatever your mother told you, it's not true. But her words fell on deaf ears. Mrs. Charlotte's poison had done its work, and Nelson's trust in Hannah was shattered. In his pain and anger, he made the decision that would change both of their lives forever. I can't do this anymore, Hannah. I think it's best if you leave. Hannah felt as though the ground had been ripped out from beneath her. She stared at Nelson, the man she had loved and built a life with, unable to comprehend how things had unraveled so completely. You're really asking me to leave? She whispered, her voice breaking. Nelson avoided her gaze, his jaw tight. I don't see another way. With a heavy heart, Hannah packed her belongings, her mind swirling with a mix of grief, anger, and disbelief. She had done everything she could to be a good wife, to navigate the complexities of her relationship with Mrs. Charlotte, and to protect her marriage. But it hadn't been enough. As she walked out the door, tears streaming down her face, she turned to Nelson one last time. I hope you realize the truth one day, she said softly. And when you do, I hope it's not too late. Nelson didn't respond, his back turned to her. He couldn't face the pain in her eyes or the gnawing doubt in his heart. Mrs. Charlotte watched from the shadows, her expression one of quiet triumph. She had succeeded in driving Hannah away, securing her place as the dominant figure in Nelson's life. But the seeds of betrayal she had sown would soon bear consequences she hadn't anticipated, setting the stage for the truth to come to light. The door closed behind Hannah, marking the end of her marriage and the beginning of a painful yet transformative journey. For weeks she felt lost, as though her very identity had been stripped away. The betrayal by the man she loved, and the cruel machinations of Mrs. Charlotte, left scars she feared would never heal. But even in her darkest moments, a small spark of resilience remained. Hannah moved to a new city, seeking a fresh start far from the memories of her old life. She threw herself into her career, channeling her pain into productivity. Her work ethic and determination soon earned her recognition, promotions, and respect from her peers. Over time, she built a new life, one that was defined not by the roles she played in others' lives, but by her own achievements and dreams. Yet, there were nights when the loneliness crept in. She missed the warmth of Nelson's embrace, the shared laughter, and the future they had planned together. But she also knew that the man she had loved was no longer the one she left behind. She found solace in her growing independence, discovering a strength she hadn't realized she possessed. Hannah also began to explore her passions outside of work. She took up painting, finding peace in the strokes of color that brought her emotions to life. She formed new friendships, surrounding herself with people who valued her for who she was. Slowly but surely, she rebuilt her confidence and sense of self-worth. Meanwhile, Nelson's life took a different trajectory. At first, he convinced himself that he had made the right decision in ending his marriage. Mrs. Charlotte's presence in his life was constant, her words reinforcing the idea that Hannah's departure had been inevitable. But as the months turned into years, doubt began to creep in. Nelson found himself haunted by memories of Hannah, the way her laughter filled their home, her unwavering support for his dreams, and the love they had shared. The accusations that had led to their separation began to feel hollow, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been too quick to believe his mother's claims. Though he continued to live under Mrs. Charlotte's influence, cracks began to form in their relationship. Her once subtle manipulations became more transparent, and Nelson started to see the extent of her control. He began questioning the story she had told him about Hannah's supposed infidelity, the details of which now seemed flimsy and inconsistent. As guilt gnawed at him, Nelson's life fell into a quiet monotony. Without Hannah, his days felt emptier, his achievements less meaningful. He went through the motions of work and social obligations, but his heart wasn't in it. The happiness he once felt seemed irretrievable, replaced by a lingering sense of loss. One day, while sorting through old belongings, Nelson came across a box of mementos from his marriage. Photos of him and Hannah on their honeymoon, handwritten notes filled with love and encouragement, and small tokens of their shared life brought a wave of emotion crashing over him. He realized that despite everything, he had never stopped loving her. Nelson's growing guilt became impossible to ignore. He began to reflect on the choices he had made and the role Mrs. Charlotte had played in shaping them. The realization that he had let his mother's lies destroy his marriage was a heavy burden, one that left him feeling ashamed and broken. For Hannah, life had become vibrant again. She was thriving in her career, her friendships, and her creative pursuits. She had learned to stand tall on her own, carrying the lessons of her past with grace and wisdom. But while she had moved forward, the pain of her failed marriage lingered in the background, a reminder of how deeply she had loved and lost. For Nelson, the years apart had been a time of reckoning. He knew he couldn't change the past, but the weight of his actions demanded resolution. As their lives continued on separate paths, the question remained: could the chasm between them ever be bridged, or was their love a chapter forever closed? In the silence of their separate lives, both Hannah and Nelson carried the echoes of what once was. They were two people shaped by pain, growth, and the choices that had torn them apart. And though they didn't know it yet, fate was preparing to bring their stories back together in an unexpected way. Years had passed since Hannah left, but the memory of their separation still lingered heavily in Nelson's heart. The once unshakable bond with his mother, Mrs. Charlotte, had begun to fray as subtle inconsistencies in her stories and behaviors became harder to ignore. Nelson's growing doubts were compounded by his own guilt, pushing him to seek clarity about the events that had unraveled his marriage. The turning point came during an innocuous conversation at a family gathering. Mrs. Charlotte, confident in the control she believed she still had over Nelson, recounted a familiar tale of how she had saved him from a disastrous relationship. But this time, her details were slightly different from what she had told him years ago. She spoke of seeing Hannah with a man at a cafe, claiming to have confronted her directly, a claim Nelson had never heard before. Her words struck him like a thunderbolt. "You never mentioned confronting her before," he said, his tone cautious but firm. "What exactly did she say?" Mrs. Charlotte faltered for a moment, her eyes darting as she attempted to recover. "Well, she didn't deny it, of course," she stammered. Her silence said everything. But Nelson wasn't convinced. The inconsistencies in her narrative fueled his suspicion, and he decided he needed to dig deeper. Driven by a need for answers, he sought out the friend Mrs. Charlotte had claimed had witnessed Hannah's supposed infidelity. After some effort, he tracked her down, hoping to hear the truth. When Nelson explained why he was reaching out, the woman looked puzzled. "I never told Charlotte that Hannah was with another man," she said. "In fact, I don't recall ever seeing Hannah at all. If Charlotte told you otherwise, I'm afraid she lied." The revelation hit Nelson like a wave. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that Mrs. Charlotte had fabricated the entire story. Anger and regret churned within him as he recalled how easily he had believed her, how quickly he had turned on Hannah without giving her a chance to defend herself. Determined to confront his mother, Nelson returned home that evening. Mrs. Charlotte greeted him with her usual warmth, but he could see the cracks in her composure when he brought up the conversation with her friend. "I spoke to her," he said bluntly. "She told me the truth, Mom. She never saw Hannah with anyone. You lied to me." Mrs. Charlotte's face paled, and for a moment she was speechless. But then she straightened, her tone defensive. "I was only trying to protect you, Nelson. I knew she wasn't right for you. She was too ambitious, too independent. She didn't prioritize you the way a wife should." Nelson's voice shook with anger. "You didn't protect me. You destroyed my marriage, my happiness, because you couldn't stand the thought of me putting someone else first. You lied to me, Mom, and I believed you. I threw away the best thing in my life because of you." Mrs. Charlotte tried to justify her actions, but her words rang hollow. Nelson stormed out, his heart heavy with the weight of his realization. He had allowed his mother's manipulations to blind him, and in doing so, he had betrayed the woman he loved most. Determined to make amends, Nelson began piecing together what little he knew about Hannah's life after their separation. Through mutual acquaintances and social media, he learned that she had moved to a different city and had built a successful career. Hearing of her resilience and accomplishments only deepened his regret. Meanwhile, Nelson wrestled with how to approach Hannah. He knew that an apology, no matter how heartfelt, could never undo the pain he had caused her. But he also knew he had to try, if not for reconciliation, then at least to give her the truth and the closure she deserved. As he prepared to face Hannah once more, Nelson couldn't help but wonder whether she would even be willing to hear him out. The years apart had changed them both, but the truth he now carried felt like a key to a door he had closed long ago. Whether that door could be opened again, he didn't know, but he was ready to try. After years apart, Nelson finally musters the courage to confront his past mistakes and seek redemption. The weight of guilt, regret, and the unshakable memories of Hannah haunt him daily. Armed with the newfound truth about Mrs. Charlotte's manipulation and a desperate hope for forgiveness, Nelson embarks on a journey to find Hannah. When he finally locates her, he is struck by how much she has changed, and yet how much she remains the same. Hannah, now independent and confident, has built a life for herself that exudes strength and resilience. She greets Nelson cautiously, her heart a mix of lingering hurt and curiosity about his sudden appearance. Nelson begins with a heartfelt apology, his voice trembling as he recounts his realization of the pain he caused her. He explains the lies he blindly believed and his regret for letting his mother's influence cloud his judgment. Tears well up in his eyes as he admits that losing Hannah was the worst mistake of his life. Hannah listens silently, her emotions tumultuous. The betrayal she experienced had left deep scars, but as Nelson continues, she senses the sincerity in his words. She questions him, seeking closure on why he chose his mother's words over hers and whether he truly understands the depth of the hurt he inflicted. Their conversation stretches for hours, diving deep into their past, the challenges they faced, and the pain they both endured. Nelson pleads for another chance, not just for their relationship, but to show Hannah that he has changed. He speaks of his efforts to make amends, including confronting Mrs. Charlotte and holding her accountable for her actions. Hannah, while moved by his words, is hesitant to let down her guard. She explains how hard it was to rebuild herself and questions whether reopening old wounds is wise. Nelson acknowledges her strength and vows to support her, whether she decides to let him back into her life or not. As they part ways, Hannah reflects on their conversation, torn between the love they once shared and the life she has built. In the following weeks, Nelson proves his dedication by showing her consistent kindness and respect, giving her the time and space she needs. The chapter concludes with a moment of resolution. Whether Hannah and Nelson rekindle their love or find peace in forgiveness and closure, the focus shifts to the themes of personal growth, accountability, and the enduring power of love and reconciliation. The final scene leaves readers with a poignant blend of hope and reflection, underscoring the transformative nature of facing one's mistakes and seeking to heal the wounds of the past. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you in my next video. Until then, stay safe.